Back to the Future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
I was devastated. I thought if I could build a time machine, that I could go back and see him again and tell him what was going to happen, and maybe save his life. And so that became an obsession for me.
Some stories do not fit anywhere comfortable. They do not belong in the category of things that can be explained with the tools that explanation normally provides, and they do not belong in the category of things that can simply be dismissed, because the people who experience them are still living with the residue of something they cannot account for. The story of a self-taught electrical experimenter who vanished from a rural property in the American Midwest in the late 1990s, leaving behind a burned garage and a cryptic note and no other physical trace, would have been strange enough on its own terms. It became something considerably stranger when, nearly 3 decades later, a series of connected events in a farmhouse in Ohio suggested that the man had not simply gone somewhere. He had become something. A person existing at the edge of other people's ability to perceive and remember him, present in the world but dissolving from the minds of everyone he encountered, a ghost made not of death but of some alteration to the machinery of consciousness itself. The account that has been circulating in paranormal research communities and late-night listener forums since late 2022 is one of the most genuinely unsettling pieces of extended mystery storytelling in the tradition that Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM established in American radio culture. Whether you approach it as documented fact, as elaborated folklore, or as the kind of story that contains a truth more important than its literal accuracy, it does not leave you the way it found you. The figure at the center of this account grew up in rural Missouri in the 1970s and 1980s without the educational credentials or institutional connections that typically provide access to serious scientific work. What he had instead was an obsessive relationship with electricity that began in childhood and never moderated. He taught himself from library books and salvaged equipment, spending hours in improvised workshop spaces building high-voltage demonstrations that served no purpose except to let him be close to the raw physics of electrical discharge. The Tesla coil, the Jacob's ladder, the Van de Graaff generator. These were his entry points into a relationship with electromagnetic phenomena that would eventually consume his life entirely. There was nothing unusual about a technically minded person pursuing this kind of self-directed exploration. What became unusual was what he reportedly noticed while conducting what should have been entirely routine demonstrations with equipment that any physics classroom might contain. The specific observation that redirected his experiments involved the behavior of small metallic objects placed within the electrical arc of a Jacob's ladder apparatus when a laser beam was introduced into the arc in a particular configuration. The arc's normal behavior changed in ways he had not encountered in any of the technical literature he had access to. More significantly, objects within the modified field appeared to exhibit brief periods of absence. Not movement, not vibration, but a complete disappearance from the visible space they had occupied, followed by return to the same position. He was meticulous enough to distrust his own eyes. He systematically varied the conditions, changed the objects, controlled for the obvious optical explanations, and eventually concluded that whatever he was observing was not an artifact of the arc's brightness washing out his vision. He began keeping detailed records, and those records eventually led him to pick up the telephone and call the most famous venue for fringe science and unexplained phenomena in American broadcast history. Coast to Coast AM under Art Bell was a genuinely extraordinary cultural institution in the 1990s. Broadcasting from a studio in Pahrump, Nevada through the late hours of the night to an audience that could be measured in millions at its peak, Bell created a space in which callers could bring the strangest experiences of their lives and receive not ridicule but serious engagement from a host who was deeply intelligent, deeply skeptical in the technical sense, and deeply committed to the position that the universe contained more than conventional institutions were prepared to acknowledge. The researchers, experiencers, and plain ordinary people who called Bell's show in those years produced some of the most compelling audio documents of late 20th century American paranormal culture. And the calls that came in from the Missouri experimenter across 1995 and 1996 became among the most discussed and analyzed recordings in the show's history. Bell pushed back on his claims, asked hard questions about methodology and evidence, and clearly experienced genuine unease at what the caller was describing as the experiments escalated from flickering objects to biological subjects to the experimenter himself stepping partially into the field and reporting that time seemed to behave differently within it. The progression of the experiments across those 2 years followed a pattern that Bell's audience found deeply compelling, and that researchers who have subsequently analyzed the recordings find genuinely interesting from a psychological perspective, if not necessarily from a physics perspective. What began as a modest anomaly, small objects briefly absent from observable space, escalated through a series of stages that each seemed to push the phenomenon further than it had previously gone. A wooden block that returned from a 3-second absence at a temperature significantly below the ambient air. A flower that came back wilted, as though it had experienced a duration of time inconsistent with the seconds of its disappearance. A mouse that survived its transit through the field but exhibited behavioral abnormalities that persisted until its death 2 days later. Each experiment produced results that, if taken at face value, suggested the field was doing something to the objects within it that went beyond any straightforward physical explanation available in the standard framework. And each experiment pulled him further into an obsession that Bell himself expressed serious concern about on air. The final call, in early 1996, contained claims that moved beyond the experiments into territory that affected the experimenter himself. He described having partially entered the field. Not fully, not yet, just enough to experience what the edge of it felt like from inside. His account of that experience described a perceptual alteration in which the external world seemed to be moving at a reduced rate relative to his own experience, as though his internal time was running at a different speed from the time outside the field. He was careful not to claim definitively that this constituted time travel in any conventional sense. He described it as something, a disruption of normal temporal experience, a place where the relationship between his subjective time and the external world's time was different from what it was supposed to be. Bell's response was one of the most direct expressions of genuine alarm in the host's long career of engaging with extraordinary claims. He urged the caller to stop, to bring in other people, to not pursue the next step alone. The caller said he would call back in March with proof. That call never came. What investigators found when they eventually reached the rural property was a burned garage and a concrete floor bearing a 6-foot circular mark that the fire's pattern did not fully explain. There was no body. There was no evidence of where the experimenter had gone. In a toolbox that survived the fire, a note had been left that read as though its author expected to be gone. Not a suicide note, not a farewell, but a statement about perception and reality that seemed to be summarizing something he had concluded. The official response was the conclusion one would expect: a missing person report, an assumption of voluntary disappearance, a case that remained open in a technical sense but was not actively pursued. In the early internet communities that formed around paranormal topics in the late 1990s, the case achieved a different kind of status. One of those foundation stories that gets passed from forum to forum, accumulated with detail and speculation, becoming a piece of shared mythology for communities that take seriously the possibility that some human experiences are not accommodated by standard explanatory frameworks. The story's next documented chapter did not arrive until 2006, when a physics academic with an interest in fringe science received an email from an address he could not trace. The sender identified himself as the experimenter and stated that he was not dead, but that he was not quite present in the normal sense either. He attached technical documents he described as representing an advanced iteration of the work he had been doing, and he added a warning that they should be studied but not replicated. The academic attempted to respond and found that the email address did not accept incoming messages. A trace of the originating IP led to a public library in Hawaii. When the library was contacted, no record of any patron matching the description could be found. The documents themselves were analyzed by several people with relevant technical backgrounds over the years since, and the consensus has been that they described a coherent internal system without mapping onto any recognized physics framework, either the product of genuine unconventional research or of someone with sufficient knowledge of technical language to produce plausible-seeming but ultimately non-standard material. The 2022 discovery in an Ohio farmhouse represents the most extensively documented chapter of the story. A couple who had purchased the property and were conducting renovation work found a sealed wooden container in an attic space that showed no signs of recent disturbance. The box was labeled with a name and a date-sensitive instruction. Inside were journals spanning approximately a quarter-century of documented experimentation, circuit materials in varying states of preservation, and a photograph showing a man standing next to a large ring-shaped metal construction. The date stamp on the photograph was from 2021. Most significantly, One of the journals contained the precise address of the farmhouse where the box was found, accompanied by a notation about magnetic field properties of the location and an indication that the box had been placed there for specific future discoverers, identified not by name but by circumstance. The question of how this information could have been recorded in a journal that appeared to predate the couple's purchase of the property is the detail that most people who engage with the story find either most compelling or most indicative of an elaborate construction, depending on their prior orientation. When the couple shared their discovery publicly, the response from people who had been following the original story for years was immediate. Within weeks, they reported receiving a phone call from someone who identified himself as the missing experimenter and asked to visit. When he arrived, he was approximately the age he would have been if he had aged normally from the time of his disappearance. But his appearance suggested someone who had been worn down by something more demanding than ordinary time, the specific quality of exhaustion that comes not from years but from the sustained effort of maintaining something that should be maintained automatically. He did not claim to have traveled through time in the conventional science fiction sense. What he described instead was a phenomenon he called desynchronization, a partial decoupling of his presence from the perceptual and memorial systems of other people, such that he existed in the physical world while occupying a kind of social and cognitive blind spot. He was visible in the moment, but he did not persist in memory. People who spoke with him would find, within minutes or hours of his departure, that the conversation was dissolving from their recollection not in the way that ordinary forgetting works but in the way that a dream loses coherence, the knowledge that something happened without access to what it contained. The account he gave of the years since his disappearance described an increasingly marginalized existence. Work relationships that dissolved because colleagues could not hold on to the memory of having a colleague. Financial arrangements that collapsed because the institutions involved could not maintain the records associated with someone whose presence did not anchor in memory. A life lived in temporary accommodations and cash transactions, in spaces where short-term presence was all that was required and long-term recognition was never expected. He said the effect had worsened with each subsequent engagement with the field, as though each exposure had further damaged whatever mechanism normally allowed other people's minds to retain him. He described himself as approaching a threshold beyond which he would be effectively unperceivable, not dead, not absent, but existing in the spaces between attention, visible in the immediate moment but leaving nothing behind in any mind he passed through. The phenomenon that the couple experienced after his departure is the element of the account that most people who encounter it describe as most affecting. They both reported independently that within minutes of his leaving, his face was blurring in their recollection. Not fading the way faces fade with time, but losing coherence immediately, as though the image was being actively deleted from their access. They wrote frantically, trying to capture details before those details became unreachable. Within an hour, they were consulting their own notes like documents produced by someone else, recognizing the handwriting but unable to connect it to the experience it described. The journals and the photograph and the other physical contents of the box remained entirely real and accessible. The living memory of sitting across from a specific human being and hearing him speak was dissolving faster than they could document it. The concept that the account develops around this experience, that memory is not simply a recording of reality but is in some sense constitutive of social reality, that a person's existence as a social being depends on their persistence in the minds of others, and that whatever the experiments had done to the experimenter had damaged that persistence, is the philosophical core of what makes the story genuinely interesting apart from its literal claims. The questions it raises about what it means to be real to other people, and what the consequences are when that reality is damaged, are not dependent on any specific claim about electromagnetic physics or temporal mechanics. They touch something that everyone who has experienced significant loss, of recognition, of connection, of the sense that their presence registers in the people around them, will find familiar in at least its emotional texture. The journals were sent to a private research archive, per the request made during the visit. The farmhouse attic was secured. Reports have circulated since then of encounters in various locations that may or may not involve the same person, a figure who introduces himself with a name that the people he introduced himself to find themselves unable to recall shortly afterward, who asks questions at the edges of academic events about the relationship between memory and physical presence, who appears in shelter records as a man with unusual technical knowledge who did not stay long enough to leave a lasting impression. Whether these reports represent real encounters with a real person or the natural elaboration of a story that has taken on a life of its own in the communities that carry it is a question that probably cannot be definitively answered. What is certain is that the story endures, that it has been refined and extended by each new chapter without losing the quality of internal coherence that gives it its particular power, and that it raises, in fictional or factual form, questions about reality and perception and the nature of human presence that do not disappear when the story ends.